Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we're going to be starting on a new book to replace the Albert Einstein book. And I figured it'd go well with the Martin Luther King we are reading. This is Freedom Rider. It's not a long book, it's just under 200 pages. But this is Autobiography of a Freedom Rider, My Life as a Foot Soldier for Civil Rights. But um, it's, I guess, based on the life here of Thomas M. Armstrong, who was a freedom rider in Mississippi. Um, let's see. On the back it says he was at the forefront of the early protests of black Southerners for voting rights and equal public accommodations from 1958 to 61, resulting in threats that had him running for his life. He resides now in Naperville, Illinois. But I guess it's about his time in Mississippi went during the freedom rides. Okay, but we will skip the forward. It's not too big, but we'll skip that. Introduction. I think that is what we'll start with today, which, let's see. It's about 6.5 pages. But let's hop into this here. I marvel at the way the American civil rights movement continually inspires people all over the world, and how the freedom rides of 1961 are seen as a key accelerant in the movement that opened the way to revolutionary change in this nation. Long before anyone dreamed that racial integration was possible in the South or anywhere, blacks were excluded. Interracial teams of Americans boarded Greyhound and Trailways buses, as well as other modes of interstate travel, and rode fearlessly into the segregated South. In addition to a series of bus rides, the Freedom Riders included other dramatic demonstrations, constituting a pivotal moment in American history. The range of reactions in the South varied from town to town, and the rows of Southerners were often quite different from what has been written in historical accounts. Many of us were born and raised in the Jim Crow South, were transformed by power of nonviolent direct action, and moved to confront the laws and customs under which we had been formed. The Freedom Riders were themselves a diverse group of individuals from all over the country. Hardly anyone today, it seems, realizes the terror that existed amongst black Southerners during most of the last century, and that a generation of Americans who experienced that life remains very much a part of contemporary society. Fannie Lou Hamer once described precisely what it was like. There's so much hate. Only God has kept the Negro sane. those who branched out into the sea of hate, especially those of us who formed the basis of the Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee in Mississippi, were labeled as misfits and agitators by mainstream society in the early 1960s. It took tremendous courage for us to stand up to the violence of the KKK and the White Citizens Council. And yet, as responsible citizens, we would not be deterred from striving for justice. Truly one of the noblest goals any of us can strive for. The early days of the civil rights movement were among the most important of my life. My movement friends and I formed a bond of intense love for each other like I have not felt since my participation in the movement, which lasted from 1958 to 1963. This frequently misunderstood period of history helped propel a larger movement that followed, and acknowledgement must be given to various events that had been quietly playing out for at least a decade prior to any involvement. Most people were not inclined to take the risk we did to break the code of conduct that divided the South into separate worlds. By rallying against what was the norm, we placed ourselves in harm's way through nonviolent means. As a consequence, I was forced, against my will, to sever ties with my parents and others in my extended family in the all black community of Lucas in South Mississippi. The 1960s fight for freedom in America was not unlike our 1930s Abraham Lincoln Brigade in the Spanish Civil War, or the Organization of Industrial Workers in the CIO, or the fight against fascism in World War II. But unlike veterans of each of those struggles, our hurt veterans had no post-struggle support systems. There was no veterans of the Lincoln Brigade organization, no labor unions to provide emotional or financial support for its early organizers, no GI Bill to provide financial aid, or Veterans Administration to provide physical and mental health care. Some of us walked through these times physically unscarred, and yet we experienced deep and intense fear. We became the walking wounded, suffering from the dramatic effects of post-traumatic stress syndrome. In many cases, we manifested into additions of various kinds: homelessness, mental illness, and other problems. Most of us forever altered from our civil rights experiences. For nearly 40 years, I seldom talked about my engagement in the movement, an era that represented one of the most restrictive environments for a person of color in Mississippi's history. I had placed those days far back in my mind, although I had never regretted the choice I made to proclaim publicly that segregation was wrong. However, in recent years, I've become concerned that succeeding generations may never fully recognize the magnitude of sacrifice that tens of thousands of people, the foot soldiers, gave in the civil rights movement at the in the name of true and inclusive democracy. I began to revisit this period of my life 10 years ago when the classified files of the now defunct Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission were made public. I was finally able to see some of what I was I had suspected over the years, but could only imagine. The files contained evidence that I and many others I knew had been spied upon by fellow citizens during that time. Created 2 years after the 1954 Supreme Court ruling on Brown v. the Board of Education, which declared racially segregated schools unconstitutional, the Sovereignty Commission's stated mission was to protect the sovereignty of the state of Mississippi and her sister states from federal government interference. The commission officially closed in 1977. Legal changes over privacy issues delayed release of the files until 1998. The files are now available through the Mississippi State Department of Archives and History, which has created an online database accessible from its website. Among many revelations in the files is the fact that the commission collaborated with the notorious white citizens' councils to spy on civil rights workers. This memoir exposes the findings of the commission's investigations that focused on on me and people I knew. During the years 1960 to 1964, the Sovereignty Commission spent a tremendous amount of energy investigating me. The state-funded agency sent investigators into my home community to interview some of my teachers, friends, and relatives. During each encounter, the investigators would tell the interviewee not to tell anyone what was asked or said. Of course, after the interviews, many of these people reported directly to my family. Each of them said they provided very little information to the investigators. Many stated that they didn't know my family or that I may have been a member of other Armstrong families who lived near my home near Prentiss, Mississippi. This is a way of local blacks taking care of their own. I wanted to make note of the fact that Mississippi, the heart of Southern tradition, is a far different place today than it was in the 1960s. As Jan Hillegas, one of my friends who helped open the door to change and still lives in the state, likes to say, it is a new Mississippi. A flowering of the black middle class and political influence in the state point to major improvements that can be directly linked to the end of segregation, which came to pass less than 50 years ago. Much of the South has entered an era of reconciliation with its divided past. Mississippi is taking steps to commission a civil rights museum and a string of civil rights heritage sites. My former high school, Prentiss Normal and Industrial Institute, one of a handful open to blacks when I was growing up, has been designated a state historical landmark. The sheer depth of change we managed to make with our weapons of morale and spiritual forces left me breathless when I returned to Mississippi in 2001 for the 40th anniversary of the Freedom Rides. It was the first time I'd been there with John Trumpower Mulholland since the 1960s, when it was dangerous for me to be seen in public with her or Joan Trumpower Mulholland, since the 1960s, when it was dangerous for me to be seen in public with her because of different skin color. When we were college students working as organizers on the freedom movement, we would sometimes drive into Jackson and Joan would have to lie down in the rear seat so as not to be seen by other whites. Riding in a car with her though through the streets of Jackson now is very strange and strangely wonderful indeed. The following year, an extended drive through the rural North Mississippi with Dory Ladner and Jan Hillegas, who is also Caucasian, produced that same feeling. We traveled to Philadelphia for a program honoring the lives of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. The election of President Barack Obama was the culmination of the efforts of thousands of people just like me who realize the need to create a more perfect union. Some of those people, those foot soldiers, died in their quest to make such an election possible. Now each of us shares the responsibility to go a step further, to make this great country even greater. There is a new movement afoot, led by a new generation of young people that is not aimed at fighting against injustice, but for the creation of equality and justice for all people. This important job requires us to think beyond ourselves and work for the betterment of others. That is how the Freedom Riders seized the attention of the nation in 1961, when ordinary men and women knew that that progress was possible, and despite often violent opposition, they wasted no time in taking action. They made a difference. Whatever difference I might have made, a civil rights movement has given me much in return. The true sense of purpose and an abiding personal fulfillment. Thomas M. Armstrong. But yeah, that'll end the introduction to the book. Next episode, we will be looking at starting the first chapter. But yeah, we see much of what is talked about from the writings and speeches of MLK I've been reading. The Freedom Rides were also listed in that. Now, this is from the view of he calls himself a foot soldier for civil rights. So it's someone on the ground and not necessarily leading the people in their movements. But is one of the people who would sit down at lunch counters, who would sit on the buses during the Freedom Rides. You know, the people putting the effort in. Not that the leaders didn't, but they often get more of the acknowledgement for their position as leaders. This is from the view of someone who supposedly works on the front lines, or worked on the front lines of the movement. But we see him talking about SNCC, which he was a part of. I think that was the one that King did lead, as a matter of fact. There was SNCC, SLCL. Uh, let's see. Uh, my mind's blanking on me now. Black Panther Party was a little later into the 60s. Um, shoot. NAACP. But yeah. Uh, but that'll end this episode. I'll see you all in the next. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing. Ask them to cite their sources. As I said, I'll see you all next time. Until then, later.